right, welcome back everybody to Medical Education in the New Millennium. Today we're going to be talking about reimagining medical education. We're very lucky to have Dr. Prober here to speak with us on that. But first, our Ignite speaker. Lynn Nye is an MD candidate at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. She's a graduate of Stanford University. She has been involved in numerous medical education initiatives, including the launch of Stanford Ames Lab's innovative online course to prepare anesthesia interns for residency. She continues to serve as a facilitator and researcher for multiple online courses run in the AIM Lab, and recently presented early stage results at the American Society for Anesthesiology annual meeting. So I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Welcome to Medical Education in the New Millennium, a new course from the Stanford University School of Medicine. This interdisciplinary course is produced by Stanford Medicine X and features talks from thought leaders and innovators from medical education, instructional design, cognitive science, online learning, and emerging technology. Over the course of 11 weeks, we'll consider how to build educational experiences that address the unique learning preferences of today's millennial medical students and residents, address gaps in the current medical education system, and explore what might be accomplished when all healthcare stakeholders are included in the conversation. If you are joining us for the first time, a quick reminder that there's a simultaneous conversation happening on Twitter right now using the hashtag MedX. Christopher Snyder, otherwise known as I Am Spartacus, is the in-class moderator for today's program and will be taking questions from social media. So please, make sure to start up your Twitter client to join in the online conversation and interact with today's speakers. Please also make sure to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/StanfordMedX. Please note, you are watching a live online program and there is a delay between real-time events and the live stream you are watching. Tweets from our in-class guests will appear before you see the real-time events they are tweeting about unfold on the video live stream.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Joshi, for the introduction. We've gotten incredible talks by Dr. Dan Schwartz and Dr. Brian Bartabedian over the couple past weeks about how to incorporate what we know about human cognition and learning, as well as a patient voice to medical education. Today, I'd like to share my experiences in medical school to help frame what we've learned about these innovations and to start thinking about how we can apply them to today's doctors in training who are part of the demographics called millennial learners. So what is medical school anyway? Some equate medical school to learning a new language. They say that the vast amount of material that we have to learn is akin to drinking from a fire hose, or worse, a tidal wave, due to the growing body of biomedical knowledge. This is my small group at USC. Yes, we're eager medical students. During our first and second year of medical school, known as the preclinical years that Dr. Joshi was talking about, we dissected a cadaver together in an anatomy lab, went through labs together, and got to go into the county hospital to interview patients and get our feet wet in patient care, starting the first week of medical school. But we're more than just eager medical students. Most models of medical education have traditionally assumed that learners are blank slates and empty vessels that simply need to have knowledge poured into them. But more and more medical schools are looking for diverse student bodies and well-rounded students. My group is no exception to this rule. Surprisingly, we get along pretty well despite our personality differences. However, I've learned that our learning styles together as a group have been mediated by what we already knew and our prior associations and experiences before coming into medical school, thus shaping us into divergent career paths, as you can see here. So right now I'd like to do a short experiment. I'm going to play a familiar tune on my violin, and I want you to just think about what emotions and memories it evokes for you. many people have heard that melody before? Everyone. Does anyone remember what they were doing at the time that they first heard that melody? Well, I can tell you my experience. I was 7 years old, sitting in my mom's minivan, and I heard the song on the radio, and it was actually one of the first pieces that inspired me to learn to play the violin, so it's a special piece for me. So this is a great example of how our memories are cued by emotional events. In this case, listening to a nostalgic piece of music probably triggered memories in all of you guys. Music is one of the few activities that involves the whole brain, not surprisingly holding benefits not only for learning language, but improving memory and focusing attention, as well as physical dexterity and coordination. So we've already used technology to scale the experience of listening to music, and now we're just beginning to see how we can harness similar sensory experiences in medicine in ways that can be used to teach people. So I've learned that medical school is not one size fits all. My classmates all enter this unique educational experience with their own prior knowledge, experience, and associations. To me personally, multisensory learning through music has helped me, as a millennial learner, challenge that knowledge, build upon it, and retain more. Transferring this to medicine, I feel that utilizing emotions and multiple sensory modalities for our future medical innovations will help cater to the different learning styles that is inherent to any medical school class. So with that, I hope that the innovations that we are going to be talking about throughout the year will make learning more fun, continuous, and engaging. Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Charles Prober. Dr. Prober is Senior Associate Dean for Medical Education and Professor of Pediatrics, Microbiology, and Immunology at Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Prober has been involved in multiple medical education projects throughout his career. He has directed a number of undergrad and graduate student courses in the classroom and at the bedside, served as Associate Chair for Education in the Department of Pediatrics, and has lectured locally, nationally, and internationally on infectious diseases and medical education. As Senior Associate Dean, he oversees undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate medical education at Stanford. But first, we're going to go to a promo.
In 2015, Medicine X will be launching a new program called Medicine X Ed. This special conference, right before Medicine X 2015, will focus on medical education and what might be accomplished when all healthcare stakeholders can engage in a conversation about changing the culture of medicine through educational innovation. Of course, we'll discuss the role technology can play in medical education, but we'll also look at gaps in our current educational system, such as participatory medicine, shared decision-making, patient engagement, cost transparency, patient safety and reducing harm, and cross-cultural competencies. What other gaps might we address at Medicine X Ed? Let us know what you think by tweeting our hashtag MedX. And make sure to sign up online to learn more about Medicine X Ed and how you can get involved.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Lynn. You clearly are literally a difficult act to follow. So no violin, no musical instruments, and no songs. But I am happy to speak with all of you for a few minutes on medical education in the new millennium, or reimagining medical education. And I'd really like to focus on three broad areas in my comments. And one of them is trying to argue that there is a need for change. So we've been doing medical education for a long time in various different forms, but it's time to change. A second area of focus will be a model for your consideration in terms of what a reimagined medical education might look like in the new millennium. And third is to touch upon one implementation strategy for our consideration. So with regards for a need to change, the first big paper or treatise in medical education was published over 100 years ago by a guy named Flexner, hence the name Flexner Report. And the Flexner Report defined for the first time in 1910 a model for education. And the model for education was based upon the novel ideas that we should have some criteria for finding our medical students, as opposed to before that it was first come, first served, more or less, that we should establish a scientific basis for medical practice, and let's call that preclinical education, at least that's what we call it today. And then we should follow that should be about 2 years in length, and then we should follow that with clinical education, which is like an apprenticeship through various different specialties, and that's now called the clinical phase of education. And that 2 plus 2 equals 4 still, and that 4-year curriculum has more or less been the way it has existed for over 100 years. And there's nothing wrong with that model. We're creating great physicians who go out and do many different things, but there are opportunities for change. And the first articulation in book form of opportunities for change is the book on the right, which I'm also holding up, about educating physicians. This is sort of the modern Flexner Report. It was published by colleagues up at the University of California, San Francisco, and it basically said there's a way to reconsider how we educate students. So they argued for this need to change. I would further argue the need for change is based upon these 3 interacting circles. We have a modern learner, the millennial student. And the modern learner is different from the ones that Flexner first encountered or the kind of student I was. First of all, they're different in terms of how they access information and how facilitated they are at many of the technologies that we all enjoy today. There's also a modern healthcare system, at least we hope it's a modern healthcare system, with important changes that are taking place in terms of the delivery of healthcare to a changing population, a population with multiple chronic diseases, for example. And there's a modern curriculum. A lot, of course, has been learned over the last 100 years. In fact, so much so, the biomedical revolution, so much so that nobody can cram it into their minds, even if they wanted to, in the 4 years or pick any number of years. So we need to be sensitive to that, to pick carefully what curriculum should be, and then to teach to that modern curriculum. This is an example of a word cloud on what learning can happen in the E-space. And in fact, in the middle of this word cloud is this kind of learner. And we're all used to this kind of learner. This is a bit of a fabricated picture, I suppose, with an individual with at this age with a computer, an iPad of some sort, or an iPhone, and a headset. If you come into our medical school classroom today, at Stanford or at USC or others, this is not an atypical looking picture, other than the students are a little bit older. Now, the problem with education in general often is that the students may not be as stimulated to learn. Look at this character sleeping in the corner, and this is not a new picture of education. This is from 1350. Now, what some of our classrooms look like are maybe not so much with the sleeping learner, but with the absent learner. So students are choosing to acquire their information outside of the classroom by watching videos of the lectures or in other methodologies. So we probably should meet the students where they are, which is not necessarily in the classroom. So I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to work with a guy named Chip Heath and publish a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on arguing that maybe we should have lecture halls without lectures. And the basis of the argument was it is much more engaging and sticky, made to stick, if in fact you teach students in the context of stories rather than a sage on the stage. And the book Made to Stick is authored by Chip Heath and his brother Dan, and in it, it talks about how you make stuff stick. It's not particularly brilliant, but it was a New York Times bestseller, and one of the core lessons in the book is tell it in the context of a story and it will stick. Deliver lots and lots of different loosely associated facts and it will not stick. So education, medical education, and much education, as an educator, you want it to stick with the learner. So based upon that, we're working to try to make the classroom look more like this picture than the previous picture of a classroom. This picture showing lots of students engaging with the material and with each other rather than being lectured to. So what's a possible model that can kind of pull this together in medical education? Well, I relied upon another colleague, Sal Khan, who's quite remarkable, and Sal has published also a book. Mostly he runs the Khan Academy, which is amazing in reimagining education in the K through 12 space, but also Sal published this book, The One World Schoolhouse, which argues about a model of education, again, that is more engaging and is more collaborative, hence the One World Schoolhouse, and is more democratized and therefore disseminatable, if that's a word, to different parts of the world. And in the paper that Sal and I published in a journal called Academic Medicine, we suggested this is a way to reimagine medical education. And this is the picture of that reimagination. And I'm going to walk through 3 parts of the picture. This part, and then the bottom part. And this part is the core curriculum in medical education. And in my opinion, we should be sensitive in creating that core curriculum so that it is minimized, not for the sake of being minimalist, but that we pick the most important foundational information that is evergreen, meaning we know it to be true. It's been around for long enough that we've tested it, we know it to be true. We want to test modern scientific discovery methods, but in terms of the core information, we should teach that which is minimal, foundational, evergreen, and you can do it through videos, or you can do it through books, or you can try to get people to come to the classroom. The second piece is the interactive part. Bring the students together in a richly interactive environment, which could be, as somebody talked about earlier in our meeting today, the anatomy laboratory, which is deeply memorable for medical students when they're working with their cadavra. That is interactive learning. Or in the simulation suite, as is depicted in one of those pictures, or in simply, and I don't really mean simply, interacting with each other as learners from broad disciplines. And the third piece is what I refer to as deeper dives. And the deeper dives are after the student has got the minimal information which is made to stick, then allow the student to explore their own specific passions and explore them deeply, whether they're biochemistry, community health, political science, biomedical engineering. Each student has got their own passion, and let them develop those passions individually based upon what they care about and what their school is best at, as opposed to trying to teach every student everything about whatever you can think of. So that's a model for consideration. So what's a possible implementation strategy is that you could deliver it in MOOCs, and you guys know what MOOCs are because you're watching one, and deliver content to a large number of students. And certainly that is an effective way of delivering to large numbers of learners. But be careful, it's not simply the delivery of the information on a memory stick from one person's computer to the other person's brain. If you want to make it stick, you got to make it interactive. So we've spent time at Stanford developing SMILEY, very smiley face, which is an acronym for the Stanford Medicine Interactive Learning Initiative. And we call it that purposely, A, because it's an acronym, but also because it underscores that it is the interaction which will make the material stick. And we have developed in this process strategies for faculty to more fully engage their students in the classroom after the students have acquired the basic knowledge on short videos that we create for many of the courses. An extension of this, as one specific example, which I'll end with, is a collaborative and interactive project which we're leading with a variety of schools listed here with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And it tries to bring this model that I've described to life. One, that it's collaborative and we agree upon what the core material is. And two, is that when we create the material, we pay attention to the content and delivering the content and to the interaction. And we started this program, and here's an arrow of our production, by first of all having the schools to try to come to agreement on what the core content is in a particular and specific area. It happens to be in microbiology and immunology because I do infectious diseases and it's a comfortable space for me to lead. We then design the curriculum in individual content modules, And the content modules are created by videos that first, a short video that tells a human story, articulated in cartooning, but they're real stories scripted by faculty who have taken care of those kind of patients to try to underscore this is what it's about. It's about the patient. The patient is at the center. The story is followed by a series of short voiceover PowerPoint presentations of the core, key, foundational, evergreen facts. And after the students have acquired that, they come to the classroom for facilitated interactive sessions. So this is a project under development. We're at this phase now. We've been developing this content for the last 6 months, and we will be implementing the content at those different schools starting in January of 2015. And then, of course, we'll be evaluating it because we may think it's a great idea, but we need to prove it's a great idea, or actually prove it's not a great idea, before we blossom into other parts of the preclinical curriculum. This is a picture from the course that we created to try to allow the students to have a framework for what we're teaching, and the curriculum is based upon understanding the various aspects of microbiology, shown on the right-hand side of the slide, in the context of the host, the immunologic system that tries to control the microbes, shown on this side of the slide. And when these two pieces come together, the patient, who's always at the middle of what we care for, develops a clinical illness that the students and ultimately physicians need to recognize, to diagnose it, to treat it, to understand how it spreads, and ultimately to prevent it. And so with that framework, we run the framework through the entire curriculum using that interactive model that I've described. And we hope that this reimagining of medical education will be more stimulating because it's centered in patient stories and therefore will become more memorable, that it is made to stick. Thank you very much for your attention. Actually, don't know how long I spoke for.
Thank you, Dr. Prober. We're going to do a Q&A session now. Does anyone have first questions for Dr. Prober? Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that one. Yeah.
Thanks. So one of the topics we've talked about here, and one of the aspects of MOOCs is that they're open. And you mentioned Sal Khan, and I'm wondering, outside of K through 12, when we're talking about medical school sort of education, what's the opinion or direction you think these organizations, Stanford and other institutions you listed, will take in sort of letting anyone participate in these sorts of experiences?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a very important one. So I believe that education should be available to everybody, whether it's K through 12 education or professional education, in this case, medical education. And the way that we are packaging the content that I described is easily exportable to other schools who may be interested in it. And we've actually already been approached by other schools within the United States. And my overall dream is to then export it to places that don't have the faculty resources and the facilities to be able to host this kind, or develop and host this kind of education, so into the developing world. Obviously, there will need to be modification of the content, adding some material, which to make it relevant to whatever part of the world it's in, make it accessible by language, and taking away some material which really won't be overly relevant to other parts of the world. But as Sal Khan has demonstrated in the Khan Academy, he is now in every country in the world with his content translated in those countries, actually by volunteer translators mostly, and it is being enjoyed and used very, very broadly. I have the same view in terms of medical education, in terms of democratizing it. And if it's useful for schools, so be it. What will make individual schools, what will make the schools unique, and is what makes them unique today, is the interaction which takes place in those schools with those faculty and those peer students who work together. So schools will remain unique. The only common part for the schools that use this content is they'll be using the same content. Thank you.
So we've been getting a lot of questions on Twitter, but first I wanted to ask a question of my own. So the medical field is situated in this construct where medical students have to pass test after test, and many students end up studying solely for the exams. How do you mediate this and utilize third-party applications like question banks into your new curriculum that you're proposing?
So that's a question that especially a medical student would ask who's gone through the licensing or two of the licensing examinations. USMLE, which stands for United States Medical License Examination. Step 1 and Step 2 are taken during medical school. Step 3 typically during internship. And these are the bane of medical educators' existence. And they also are the bane of medical students who really, as you're implying or stating, are what students focus on. And so the challenge must be, and your question exemplifies that, to make this content not only sticky, but for the students to understand, oh, this is relevant to the test as well. I've begun conversations with the National Board of Medical Examiners who oversee the USMLE exam to talk about taking the content that we create in this course and ultimately the others, if they regard it as valuable as well, which I think they will, and redesigning the exam, or at least recasting the exam in the context of the content that we've identified as being core, so that there won't be a disconnect between what some schools are teaching and the student thinking, but that's not relevant to the examination. There'll be an overlap. And that's a longer term project. In the shorter term, many schools have come to the conclusion, and it's a bit of a sad conclusion, it's not really sad, but it's a bit of a sad conclusion, that we're going to do our best at stimulating and educating our students, and then we're going to give them 6 weeks or 8 weeks for them to study for the dreaded boards, where they cram all the information into their brain, as maybe you did, so they can do well on the board. And so there's sort of two parts. That what we really want to teach the students and that what they feel they have to learn. That's not ideal in any way. So our attempt is to try to pull those together.
So I'd like to shout out to Twitter at Courage Sings, asking for clarification on the patient stories part. Are the patients telling their stories, or are they told by faculty?
So thank you for that question. So the way that we have constructed it, the very best patient story is one that comes from the patient's mouth sitting in the room. And we do that when we can. But the impractical part of that is especially for infectious diseases, which tend to be acute problems, they happen and they go away, or the patient doesn't survive, obviously you can't arrange to bring those patients into the classroom. So the story has to be told in a way which feels authentic and is authentic and is gripping. So what we've settled on, and we're evaluating this, is we have a very skilled, she's a physician and an illustrator, who tells the story in this framework, using this framework all of the time, and it's a story that has illustrations which are cleverly written, cleverly drawn, that brings the different pieces together, and they're true stories. So the stories are developed with the expertise of a faculty member who's dealt with patients who have that disease. So these are true stories, obviously anonymized, that are then told in a storybook fashion. They're told over about a 7-minute period, and they try to nail as much as possible some of the core microbiology and immunology concepts that are relevant to the patient. You can imagine such a story, especially today, about Ebola virus. Now, we're not going to bring a patient infected with Ebola virus into the classroom, obviously, hopefully, but we can tell the story and make the points, and it's not as powerful as the patient being there, but it feels very authentic because it's a real story.
Hi. I think oftentimes it's a commonly held notion that at elite institutions, for pre-medical education, the professors are oftentimes just absolutely brilliant researchers, but not really teachers. And there's been a lot of frustration among students for that reason. And I was just wondering if there's been any thought about restructuring pre-medical education and helping things stick for pre-medical students.
So you mean for undergraduate students hoping to go to medicine, not undergrad, gotcha, for pre-medical students. So it is true that being a brilliant scientist doesn't make you a brilliant educator, but it's equally true that a brilliant scientist can be a brilliant educator. So they're not completely disconnected. And there are some very, very skilled teachers who are brilliant scientists or not so brilliant scientists. I think it is very important to capture the best delivery system that works, whether it's for a pre-med student or a medical student or a practicing physician. I think that helping the brilliant scientists or the not so brilliant scientists look at strategies for making their content more accessible is critically important. And that may be from technologic things, including the technology of, instead of talking for an hour, talk for 10 minutes 6 times or whatever because of attention span. But it also, I think, is important either to partner that brilliant scientist or whomever with the knowledge that telling a story about why that basic science principle is so important, telling a story about that. So for example, a thing that pre-medical students often study, because they have to, and I'm sure many of them love it, is chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry. And we have biochemistry course in the medical school. And some students love it because they're biochemistry oriented and some are not so crazy about it. So our biochemistry course, we completely did what I've described. Our biochemistry faculty created short videos to get through the biochemical concepts, which are foundational. And they then bring the students together, and we have about 100 medical students, 90. They bring them together in a large classroom divided in tables of 7. And they give them a problem which requires biochemical principles to think about, but it's about a patient with typically a metabolic disease. And as the students talk about the patient in the context of their biochemistry knowledge, it makes it much more engaging and memorable. So it is about patients again, to make it memorable. Whether that specific model will work for undergraduate students as well as medical students, we could debate, but I think that's what needs to be done. Thank you.
I have a personal experience. I studied medicine in China, and I feel like in work, the good doctor and the bad doctor difference is how can they collect the story. I understand you talk the story to the student. It's easy for them to understand, but in real life work, the people who good at collect the whole story is good doctors. If some doctor is not ask the patient history, how do they feel, they cannot collect the whole picture. So still, they cannot make very good decisions based on that.
So you're absolutely correct that some of the other skills that we want our medical student to acquire beyond the facts and how the facts relate to the patient illness is how to find out what the patient is feeling, how they're suffering, and to empathize with the patient. So separate from what I've talked about, and to your point, we spend a lot of time in teaching and working with students in their communication skills in general, and also specifically how to get a medical history. We typically start, as is true in many schools, of doing that with what we call standardized patients, who are actresses and actors, who feign illnesses or feign the script of an illness. And our job is to work with that standardized patient and optimize their ability to get the story correctly and in a sensitive way. We film those interactions. The students watch their films with a faculty member and tell them how they can improve in those different areas. And then the students, of course, eventually get into the hospital and see real patients and practice those skills. But you're absolutely correct, a very critical part of becoming a physician.
Dr. Joshi?
As we talk about reimagining medical education and stickiness of material, and think about how much material every day just grows and grows, that the average student is expected to know and the average doctor expected to hold, everything can't become sticky, and if everything is memorable, then inevitably something will become less memorable. So what's the role of cognitive aids in the future of medical education? Is it something to encourage? And the second part of the question would be, how much information should a doctor be required to know, and at what point is there too much information?
So that's a very good question, and there are several parts of the question. And so, again, the concept of trying to identify, and it will take faculty of medical schools, doctors, to identify what the core knowledge is critical. So knowing what really you need to know that it just becomes part of you, that foundational material. I would argue that foundational material hasn't changed dramatically. It's changed, obviously, but over the last 20 or 30 years. the guiding principles remain very similar. There are new innovations in new antibiotics developed and new lots of stuff, but in terms of the foundational material, it can be identified, and that is what I want to stick. In terms of the details and the new treatment, so I do infectious diseases for a living. I publish a major textbook on pediatric infectious diseases, which has got chapters on antibiotics, and I do not remember or care to remember the doses of the antibiotics that we put in our chapter. I'm not even sure why we put them there, but I don't try to remember them. I mean, I have, as everybody else has, a device, of course, to carry the information, and there are very good and reliable apps, you just have to get the right ones, for accessing the most relevant information. And frankly, if I were a patient, I'd rather see my doctor look up the dose of a drug that they're going to give me, except if it's in the operating room where you want it to be a little more quick. I'd like them to look it up and confirm it rather than to think they know it. So I think much of the biomedical knowledge that is out there is something which has been nicely summarized in different sorts of electronic formats and can be and should be readily accessible. We have to teach the students the smart ways to hunt for the material, the smart and reliable ways, because there's obviously a lot of stuff you can find that is not valid whatsoever. So we have to teach the search methodologies, and we have to teach the methodologies for determining if what you find is actually accurate. So how you critically analyze the scientific literature and so forth. So I think it's extremely important that much of the information be carried in a digital brain and then is operated by a brain that understands the whole concept of illness and has a foundational framework. In this case, for infectious diseases, the foundation is understanding microbiology and immunology.
So it seems like a lot of your approach is most applicable to preclinical education. Mm-hmm. How would you take these ideas and apply it to clinical education?
Thank you. Well, that's a wonderful question as well. So I think there are equal opportunities so we have been talking about undergraduate medical education and specifically the first 2 years, but also in the second 2 years of medical school where the students are in their clinics, there is foundational knowledge in each of the clinical disciplines that the student will pass through, rotate through. There's in pediatrics, which is my specialty, in internal medicine, in anesthesiology, and so forth. And of course, Dr. Chu and his colleagues have created a lot of very valuable information online for anesthesiology, for the residents, and it can be used for the medical students. And it is foundational knowledge in anesthesia. There are certain foundational concepts in pediatrics that I want all the students to know, and it can be delivered in short snippets that they can watch at their leisure as many times as it takes to get it. And then their flipped classroom is when they go into the children's hospital and they see the patients who have the illnesses that they've either read about or had the material delivered. So there's an equal opportunity in the clinical part of training as there is in the preclinical for the core knowledge, but the flip part of the classroom in the clinical part is our hospitals and our clinics. In the preclinical part, it's our simulation labs and our lecture halls without lectures. The same is true, by the way, if you extend that up into residency. And again, anesthesia with Dr. Chu's leadership has demonstrated this in educating anesthesia residents so they're in the same place when they are starting the core part of their anesthesia training. And there's opportunities for that in other disciplines as well. And the same is true in continuing medical education, which is for practicing physicians who are out there without a lot of time that they have for doing their different things, but when they have time, they can get a dose of this online, and then their flipped classroom is their practice. So I think the model is equally applicable across the spectrum of medical education, and to an earlier question, back into pre-medical education.
You mentioned earlier that there's a slight disconnect between this new model of learning and also the outdated sort of examination methods. Then how then do you plan to evaluate this in like a couple years?
Right. So thank you. So I'm not, examinations are very important. So I don't want to imply that the examinations are outdated or bad. In fact, there's a lot of learning theory and experience that says if you quiz persons along the way of acquiring their knowledge, the quizzing process helps to embed the knowledge. So I think those kind of quizzes, just for test of did you get it, learning, are very important. And then having examinations that are well developed that bring together the principles, synthesize them, and see if they can be applied in a real scenario, that's reliable as well. So the disconnect which has occurred, though, is the students are mostly fear of the things that they fear. They mostly fear getting a high score on the examination. And as Lynn said, there are third-party providers of material to study to get those high scores. And so the disconnect is the medical schools are trying to do their best to educate their students in what the core knowledge is, and the students are using a third-party provider to study to acquire that core knowledge. The two have to be harmonized, and we have to make sure that the core knowledge we're teaching is what's on the test, and the students feel they're getting it both at the same time.
This is kind of a loaded question with an obvious answer, but it's popular. So if the goal is to prove that medical students have facility with knowledge and can apply it to clinical context, and yet the fear is, what's my step 1 score when it's a pass-fail exam, why not have all the medical schools simply petition USMLE not to report scores?
So there's a desire to do that. So the question for those who don't live in this space, which is a lot of people in this room, and the examination that we've been talking about, the USMLE, has a number associated with it. It was really meant to be a pass-fail examination. It was developed as a pass-fail examination. The number was set because of different state licensure requirements. But the number is taken on a life of its own, right? You give something a number, then everybody looks at the number. And the higher the number, the better. In this case, in golf, it's the other way around. So the number has taken on this life of its own. So everybody's saying, well, that's what's messing stuff up, so get rid of the number. And many medical school deans that I share conversations with are of the opinion that that's a great idea. And actually the National Board is fine with that idea as well. They don't really care. In fact, they agree with that more or less. But the pushback are for the principal users of the number at this point, which are the residency programs recruiting the students. So they are not so interested in losing the number, because the number, not only is it convenient and scaled, it is easy to look at, which is a convenient part. And if you're seeing 1,000 applications in a highly competitive discipline, you could use as one of your first screen the number. But it makes no sense to use the number, but people do it because it's convenient. It makes no sense because the number is representing the knowledge acquired in the first 2 years of medical school, and the student hasn't even seen a patient yet, and it's being used by residency programs that are bringing the students in to do clinical stuff. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, and most people at the program director level, meaning the residency programs level, acknowledge that. But, and of course, whenever there's a but in a sentence, it means that it's not really being acknowledged, and the number is used. So and so there's activity in that space. Again, my conversation with the National Board and deans talking, and so we'll see what happens over time.
So I really appreciate you being here tonight, and I think what you've been discussing as far as the use of video, the use of smaller chunks of instruction is really great and likely to become pretty ubiquitous. I'm curious what you think, what's the next wave? What's the tide that's still a little further out that most people haven't seen yet as far as using technology to push better education in med school?
That's a great question. I think that, so part of it is more of the same, which is not a new tide, obviously. So if this works in a course, then it should work in the other courses and so forth. So that's not, but I think that where technology can help us, and is already helping us in some segments, and perhaps many segments, is in assessment of what the student has learned. So one example, of course, is simulation, which is not new and is used a lot by our school and many other schools, but probably can be used a lot more in assessing the students' competencies. Because at the end of whatever you do, what you care about is how competent the person is, not how many years you've held them in a medical school or wherever else you're holding them. So having technology help us advance the assessment of the learner is really, the competency of the learner is really, I think, a very important next wave. We're already sort of partly on that wave, but if we can advance our ability to measure competencies, we can then also get rid of the notion that medical school or other professional schools have to be, again, of a fixed duration, because they don't have to be. It's as quickly as you want to acquire the knowledge or can acquire the knowledge, you should be able to move on. There's practical issues here, but that you should be able to move on. So I could imagine having a duration of matriculation for a professional school, whether it's law school or medical school or business school, that ranges widely between individual learners because of the frequency, the speed at which they're acquiring the information, or they got other stuff to do. Maybe they're working, to pay their tuition or whatever. So I think that one has the ability to then change the duration, but you can do that only with more of the same. More innovations is what you're asking about, but in the area of, I think, assessment is a big area. Yeah.
So I imagine a lot of medical school faculty are very used to the old system of lecture where they experienced that in med school and they've done that for a long time. How are you training these faculty to be able to do something different, like facilitate these interactive activities?
Right. So I have no data to support the percentage I'm about to give, so be it. But first of all, just getting faculty engaged, interested in a new model of learning, and whether it's medical school faculty or other professional faculty, I've put them in 3 buckets by percentages, and so this is the no basis part. There's about, seems to be maybe 20% of faculty, so it's 80-20, but this is actually 20-60-20. There's 20% of faculty or so who are interested in engaging and following a new wave, or doing something which makes sense and going for it. And they're the early adapters and the early players and whatever you want to say. There are about 20% of faculty who will go to their grave and squeaking and howling that everything's being messed up by anything that smells like this initiative. And then there's 60% who are probably just watching to determine, is this going to work and am I going to get involved? After they begin to get involved, you're absolutely correct. There needs to be some training. And the training on creating online videos, there's some people who are actually just very good at it. It's back to the question about some wonderful scientists may not be able to deliver the message clearly. Some may not. Same in the online space. There are some people, and we've had a growing experience with this, who are just really good when they're in front of a blank screen by themselves talking, and others freeze up. But they don't freeze up when they're in front of a large audience. So training just in the creation of the videos, that's a small piece. Training for the interactive sessions is going to require, I think, a lot of effort, that we're just beginning down that pathway, because we don't even know at this point what the most powerful interactive sessions are going to look like. So in this course that we're developing, there's a bunch of different varieties we're creating to try to evaluate which ones seem to work for the teacher and the learner. I'm optimistic, I'm just generally optimistic, but I'm optimistic about the faculty ability in this space, because in medicine at least, most of the clinicians who are out seeing patients, they are used to teaching in an interactive way. Their patients, hopefully, they're interacting with them, and also the students who are at the bedside with them. So I think they inherently have developed these skills, or have developed these skills over that experience. But you're correct in pointing out faculty development in any space, the old one or the new one, is very important to assure excellence in teaching.
So I have a personal stake in this question, but how can you see multimodality in multiple disciplines helping medical education, such as music, the arts, the humanities, similar to the exercise that we did this earlier in the class today?
Right, and so a wonderful question. And I think the more modalities you can put into the learner's mind, in terms of, people talk about there's the visual learner and the auditory learner, and whether there really are those differences, I'm not sure. But I think that different types of experiences, such as music, such as art, do stimulate different learners in different ways. And I think together they're synergistic with each other. So I think that the piece that you played, for example, and bringing back memories, I could imagine putting that piece. I mean, I was thinking of it's a frenetic kind of piece, and I can imagine you feel like you really need to move quickly because you're listening to that tune. Tune's not the right word, to that music, and I could imagine playing that piece and asking people about, so if this makes you feel anxious, what are you anxious about? And getting into some sort of psychotherapy in terms of how people are thinking. There's a lot of activity in some schools and subsegments of our school of taking art. There was a reference in the conversation about the Rodin Museum and going and looking at Rodin's sculpture and looking at the problems that some of them may have had with their hands and how you could fix that, how an orthopedic surgeon could fix that. That really is linking in the power of that art with the power of the orthopedic surgeon. There are other people who take their medical students into museums of paintings and talk about what are you seeing in this painting and helping to build diagnostic skills because you see the subtleties in the eyes, the subtlety in the color of the skin. There is literature in medicine. One of my friends and colleagues who teaches here at Stanford is Abraham Verghese, and his writing about it, they typically have a medical flavor, for example, Cutting for Stone, is a very powerful entry into that rich literature. It's fiction, but into the rich literature that really allows you to start thinking of the story. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity to connect the humanities and the sciences together, yes, even in medical school, or perhaps especially in medical school.
Thank you. Do you feel the technique applies equally to primary preventative care versus research and tertiary care? And I'm trying to gauge whether, what role do you see as a physician in preventing disease rather than treating disease?
Yes. Certainly a large part of medical education needs to focus on the prevention. This happens to be, again, in the area that I care a lot about because I do infectious diseases, so bugs and stuff. A lot of the action that we take around bugs is to try to figure out how to prevent them. And a lot of our teaching is in that area because that's really where the pound for the dollar can be obtained, whether it's through vaccination or through other strategies of preventing acquisition of infectious diseases. Wearing proper protective equipment when you're taking care of patients with Ebola. And as in our pediatric practice, and again, this is my own focus, but in a pediatric practice, teaching pediatricians, when they're pediatric residents, about prevention is critical. Guidance about accident prevention, starting with actually car seats. You can't get out of the hospital, as you probably know, unless you put your baby in a car seat and strap him in correctly and demonstrate that, and then you're allowed to drive away. That's prevention. So teaching about prevention in medical schools is very important, and it's already done a lot, and it needs to continue to be a large part of the focus. And the methodology, the pedagogical methodology of teaching about prevention, I think is more or less the same. The subject's a bit different.
So we have time for one more question.
Is it difficult for the patient to they accept all the students, observe all those kind of treatment or diagnose process?
Yeah. So the question is it difficult to find the patients for our students to work with? And the answer is generally no, it's not difficult. There's the patients that I referred to earlier in the conversation, the standardized patients who we pay, the actresses and actors, and they're not difficult to find. And then there are the real patients in our hospitals and clinics. And my experience with those patients is they welcome the opportunity to have somebody potentially benefit from their illness, to learn from their illness. I think it provides one positive thing for what they're experiencing. The illness is obviously negative. And again, the patients are generally very receptive to and interested in talking to and therefore teaching our students. So that it's really not a problem. I mean, there's an occasional patient who only wants to be seen by, doctor, and pick the doctor's name, and really are very adamant about that. But that's unusual. It occurs, but that's unusual.
So we'd like to shout out to some of our online members. Let's see, Annette McKinnon Anne-Marie Cunningham, Dr. Ryan Madenick, and Christoph Trapp. Thank you for joining us online. And thank you, Dr. Prober, for sharing your rich experiences in medical education. I'm sure we've all gained a lot from this experience, regardless of where we're coming from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like what you see in this class, be sure to check out our online course, Engage and Empower Me, a new online class from the Stanford University School of Medicine. We are featuring presentations from patients and experts on participatory medicine. Through this course, we hope to empower you to take part in creating a more inclusive and collaborative healthcare system. The course can be found at class.stanford.edu. As a reminder, this program is made possible by support from the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Anesthesia, Stanford AIM Lab, Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. If you haven't yet done so, please take a moment to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/StanfordMedX so you can continue the conversation online and stay informed of program updates. From all of us here at Stanford Medicine X, we want to thank you for joining us today and remind you to join us again next Thursday, October 23rd at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for another edition of Stanford Medicine X Live, featuring a new class on medical education from the Stanford University School of Medicine called Medical Education in the New Millennium. Next week, we are featuring Northwestern University Associate Professor of Anesthesia, Dr. Christine Park. For all of you out there taking time to tune in with us tonight, thank you for joining us and being part of the conversation. A special thanks to our guest panelists this evening. From all of us at Stanford Medicine X, we'll see you next time.